Global leaders are not going to be able to ignore what is going to be happening in the city because people are preparing a lot of stuff for society in the days of the COP. I think the city is going to be all about that. The city is going to be very crowded in a way that it has never been before. It's going to have a lot of attention in a way that it has never gotten before. And it's a chance of talking to people about issues that affect them. So if we're bringing global leaders to the Amazon, we have to bring the people who live in the Amazon to this conference as well in a way. So we have to involve them in the discussion. We have to involve them in the discussion that actually affects directly their territory, because we know that the first people that are going to be affected by the climate change are people who live in these areas, in the zone.
Hello everyone. You're listening to the People, Climate, Earth section of the series Between the East and the West. And I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'm delighted to have you join me as I connect the dots with amazing people who are working and living for one Earth. Because the climate story is a people's story, and together we can write a new chapter. Brazil is among the top 10 highest greenhouse gas emitting countries. A WWF report last year in 2024 warned that warming in Brazil is higher than the global average. Yet, it was said in a bold Reuters report yesterday that this country, which is hosting the UN Climate Summit COP30 in November this year, is poised to position itself as the epicenter of green economic growth. In fact, the country is already one of the largest renewable energy job creators in the world. Brazil has the power to shift the conversation. It can be the bridge between the developed and developing nations, proving that sustainable growth is possible and profitable. Now, in a world grappling with uncertainty, can climate leadership bring about economic stability and peace? What is the reality in Brazil, and how does it affect the rest of the world? So today I have the pleasure of hosting Daniela Assis, a Brazilian journalist, storyteller and campaigner with a strong background in grassroots activism. Over the last 8 years, she has helped social movements, third sector organizations, political parties, and politicians mobilize people through their stories. She's also working with Amazonia de Pé, a nationwide movement dedicated to transforming 57 million hectares of public land in the Amazon rainforest into conservation units. Thank you for joining me today, Daniela. I hope I have pronounced your name properly.
Yes, thank you, Meenu. I'm very happy to be here and to share a little bit of my thoughts and everything that has been happening to Brazil with you.
So do you think, let's begin a deep dive, do you think that Brazil is under pressure because it has the opportunity as well as the bandwidth to put climate back in the center of the global agenda at COP this year?
Yes, I think this is going to be very challenging for Brazil this year to host COP30 in Belém, which is a city that is in the heart of the Amazon, especially because of the geopolitics that we have today with Donald Trump in the presidency of the United States and not very compromised with the climate agenda. And we know that the United States is one of the main polluters that we have in the world, and not having Donald Trump and the United States compromised with the climate makes things very difficult for everyone that is fighting for this, because it's a global fight afterwards. It doesn't solve the problem only Brazil or only Latin America or only countries in the global south fighting for the climate and fighting for land's rights. It has to be a global struggle. So I think the main challenge that we're going to have this year is the geopolitics that it's been designed and the current government of the United States that we have right now, because we don't know how it's going to be in terms of climate goals to actually move forward in the agenda if we don't have the compromise of these rich countries in the fight against climate change and to have a just energy transition. So I think this is the first thing that we have to be very aware that it's going to be challenging for Brazil. And also to receive global leaders from all over the world in the Amazon, it's very important, but at the same time, it's very challenging because we have internal problems in Brazil right now regarding land rights, especially when it comes to protecting indigenous lands. We have like a very conservative and very pro agribusiness Congress right now in the country. And we've been facing issues in terms of protecting the rainforests and to protecting indigenous and quilombolas and conservation units against land grabbers and against mining and against the agribusiness companies. So this is something that we've been facing internally, but the COP is going to be in the rainforest. But the problem is the world is not discussing necessarily the use of the earth, necessarily the things about deforestation that have been worrying a lot Brazilians the past years. We have been seeing growth in deforestation. We have been seeing growth in wildfires. We have been really being worried about this topic, about the protection of the rainforest right now. And this is not usually a main topic in the United Nations conferences for climate and for environment, because usually the topics are very focused on energy transition, which is something that we should focus because it is a key point for the fight of climate change, but also it's not the main thing for Brazil right now. So I think Brazilian social movements have a little bit of this challenge of how do we talk about internal problems that are especially about land grabbing and deforestation and wildfires and the protection of indigenous lands that are in danger right now, but also talk about energy transition, which is something that Brazil, as you said in the introduction, is already a little bit more. We already have a clean energy, and we have the most of the country use a clean energy. So it's not like Brazil has the problem of energy transition right now. Brazil has to put pressure in the global north for energy transition, but the internal problems that Brazil are facing is regarding the use of the land, is regarding deforestation, is regarding fires. So I think social movements in Brazil have been facing this challenge of how are we going to frame our fight and our struggles in COP30 this year? Are we going to be there to put pressure on these global leaders who need to do a fair and just transition of energy? Or are we going to put pressure in our internal government, in our national government, so we have protected lands in the country in a time that those lands are being endangered? So I think this is something that we've been facing as social movements and environmentalist social movements and indigenous rights social movements right now in Brazil, because we want to make this COP, we want to make this conference about the peoples who live in the Amazon, about the peoples who are having their life affected in the territory that these global leaders are going to be stepping in November. But also we have a global and geopolitics problem right now that is way bigger in a sense of tackling climate change. So this is a problem that we've been facing of how we're going to frame this movement and this fight. And I think Brazil has this challenge of, I think Lula, which is the president right now, he has a very good diplomacy team. And he has been doing like many things that are putting Brazil as a leader in this topic of climate. We've hosted the G20 conference in November last year, and Brazil was in the presidency of the G20. And I think Lula did an amazing job, and the Lula team did an amazing job in terms of having consensual topics about hunger, about climate, about things that we really managed in a time that the world is facing two wars, is facing many problems internationally. Brazil managed to have consensual documents in the G20 conference last year. And I think this year, Brazil has also potential to make good agreements and to have diplomats working to make good things for the climate. But at the same time, I think it's facing this problem that it has a lot of internal problems regarding environment. So how is Brazil going to be a leader in the topic of climate if there are so many problems within the country that the president cannot solve because his hands are tied because of this conservative Congress that we have? So I think these are some of the problematics that we've been facing as social movements here, because we know the responsibility that we have right now to host the COP30 in our country, in the heart of the Amazon rainforest, to receive all of these leaders that are going to come here and see the reality that indigenous peoples and people who are fighting for climate in the Amazon are facing. But at the same time, the topic of the COP is not going to be about those people in these forests. The main topic is going to be about energy transition. And this is also like something that we know that Brazil has the capability of doing this, doing agreements and consensual agreements about climate transition and climate justice. But at the same time, we need to face the problems that we're going to have internally in the country. And we don't know how to balance this very well during the conference.
Thank you for bringing that out, because a recent report last month mentioned that except for the Brazil's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, virtually all branches of the country's government are promoting activities that actually increase greenhouse gas emissions. For instance, the Ministry of Transportation, as you all think you already indirectly said, it's intent on opening large areas of Amazon forest to the entry of deforesters. So that means that is true.
Exactly, exactly. We have a national congress here in Brazil that is composed mostly by, we usually say it in Portuguese, the BBB, which means boi, bala e bíblia. In Portuguese, this means that it's for cattle, so basically like meats to create meat. Bala, which means guns, and Biblia, which means Bible. So we have a national congress that is very conservative in terms of agribusiness, evangelical leaders that are in there, and also people who are fighting for guns. To have guns, to the right of having guns, and have a belief that public security is solved by having more guns for people and for the population. So this is the composition of the National Congress right now. And one of the B's, which is the boy, which is about the cattle, and it's about the people who owns the agribusiness and have a lot of power since the colonization, that we have 300 years of colonization from 1500 to the 1800s. And we have a problem of land concentration in the country that has been a heritage of this colonization period, that we did not have a land reform ever since we've become independent. And this is a problem because we have large parts of land in the country concentrated in few hands, in few families that have been controlling these large parts of land ever since the colonization has happened in Brazil. So even nowadays, like indigenous peoples are still fighting for the lands, quilombolas people are still fighting for the lands, and we didn't have an agrarian reform. So this is a problem because the economy of Brazil is still based on plantations, and is still based on large parts of the land to plant soy, to plant corn, to plant transgenics, to use a lot of poison as well in the plantations. And these people have a lot of power and lobby inside the National Congress. So it's very difficult to pass laws in Brazil and to pass bills in Brazil that are environmental friendly and they are friendly to indigenous rights. Even though we have a constitution from 1988 after the dictatorship in Brazil that it's very well written in terms of guaranteeing the originary people's rights in Brazil, this constitution is not followed when it comes to bills approved in the National Congress. So it's very difficult in Brazil for a federal government, that the president of the republic, to have and to pass bills that are environmental friendly because the National Congress doesn't allow. It's very difficult to approve bills that actually protect the rights of those people and the rights of the land and the rights of the nature, because the National Congress does not want that. The National Congress wants to keep on exploiting the land, wants to keep on planting soy to export, it wants to keep not respecting the rights of those who know how to take care of this land and of those who have the originary rights of these lands, because they have been occupying this before the Portuguese have arrived in the country. So it's very difficult to pass any environmentalist bills in the country. And also, some of these people are in the federal government as well. So they are present in the National Congress, but they also have the government of Lula, because Lula's government is a coalition. So for Lula to be elected in 2022, when there was the election against Lula and Bolsonaro, he had to make a coalition of parties that are not necessarily all of them progressive, all of them left wing. So there are members of the national government right now, the federal government right now, that are not aligned necessarily with progressive causes and with environmentalistic causes because it's a coalition government. So, for instance, the Ministry of Transportation, as you were saying, it's one of those who are more aligned with the interests of those who want to explore and to actually not take care of the rainforest than of the indigenous peoples and the environmentalists and the people who are fighting for the rainforest. So they want to build more roads in the Amazon, for instance, so it's more easy for those land grabbers to explore more of the rainforest. So they have been trying to build roads in places where we have isolated groups of indigenous people that have not been these groups are protected by the constitution. They cannot be contacted because they do not want to. So these are like isolated groups of indigenous people that may have roads passing through their territories because of these things that the government is trying to pass. They say that it's gonna make everyone's life easier in the Amazon because people want roads to move around in the rainforest and to be easier to also like get resources from the rainforest and to deforest in a way because like it's expanding agribusiness and expanding mining and expanding ways of occupying the forest. But in fact, it's actually destroying the rainforest because every time that we have a road cutting the rainforest, the deforestation also begins to increase. And the primary rainforest that we usually have there begins to fade away because people have more access to those rainforests that are more isolated. So it's very complicated the fact that the Ministry of Transportation wants to open more roads in a place that it's protected and it should be protected and designated only for the indigenous people who are there because those are the people who know how to take care of the rainforest and who know how to live in peace with the rainforest. So when you open roads inside this big forest that we have, you are actually opening roads for deforestation and for mining and for land grabbing. So this is one of the problems that we're facing. I think the other problem that is also very, very complicated that environmentalists in Brazil are facing right now is the fact that they want to explore the oil in the Amazon River. So the end of the Amazon River is in the Atlantic, close to Guyana and into the Ecuador line. And they are saying that there's a huge amount of oil and in this place, and they want to start to exploring this. So this is very controversial because in a time that we're talking about fair and energy transition, and we're talking about being a climate leader that is going to receive global leaders from all over the world in the heart of the Amazon, we're also talking about the exploitation of the Amazon River and the possibility of having oil there. And this is something that can devastate environmentally and also socially and politically the country. Because when you find, I once was talking with a Venezuelan friend, and I remember her saying exactly those words, that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to a country, especially a global south country, is to find oil in their lands because it becomes like a geopolitical war for resource in your country. And this is something that could also happen in Brazil right now. If we find oil in this place and if we find oil in a place, especially this one, which is a place with a lot of biodiversity, a place where the Amazon meets the Atlantic Ocean, a place where it's the end of the flow of the biggest river of the world. And if we find oil there, it's going to be very complicated for Brazil socially, politically, and environmentally, especially for the peoples who live in this part of the country. So it's very controversial for the national government right now to be hosting COP30 and to be trying to place themselves as a climate leader and as a global south leader in the fight for climate change, but also to be opening roads inside of the rainforest and to be exploring oil in the Amazon River. I don't think this is something that is aligned with the discourse that he's been trying to say.
Thank you for sharing that. What is, according to you, as far as the global scenario is concerned? I remember at some point you had mentioned for what is the main focus of COP then for the world?
I would say it's energy transition The world right now cannot sustain anymore the energy model that we have. It's a lot of emission of pollutants, gases, and especially by the global north countries. So this is why I think it's going to be very challenging this year if we do not have the compromise of United States, if we do not have the compromise of many of the countries of the European Union, if we do not have really a global alliance for this to happen, for we to stop using fossil fuel energy, for we to stop use this type of energy that has been polluting and has been the main cause that we have right now for climate change. So this is something that has to stop for yesterday. This is something that cannot go any longer. And I think Brazil's COP is important in that way, in that sense, because the past COPs that we had, they were in countries where they do not have a clean energy based matrix. So we had the COP in Saudi Arabia, we had the COP in Azerbaijan, and those are countries that do not have a solution for energy transition. Those are countries that have faced in their COPs, in the conferences, a lot of lobby from oil companies, a lot of lobby of those companies that are the ones that are actually responsible for climate change. And I think Brazil has the chance of doing it differently because we still have a majority of clean energy in the country, even though we have this challenging happening right now in the Amazon River that they want to try to find oil to explore that. We still have a clean energy based matrix. And this is something that the past countries that received the COP didn't have. So I think this, and also like Brazil, with all the challenges that we have when it comes to democracy and human rights, we still are a democracy. And I think also like the countries that received the COP last years were not a democracy. They were people who were there as social movements, as civil society, have faced problems and difficulties to have their marches and to have their protests happening the same ways that in other COPs they had. And in Brazil, it's different because we have a very well organized civil society. We have movements that are historical in the countries. We have one of the biggest social movements in the world, which is the MST, the landless workers movement. We have a very well organized indigenous movement that is planning to be camping outside of the conference for all of the days of the conference. They're all actually at this time today in this week they are reunited. The indigenous movement is united in Brasilia, the capital of the country, in their 21st camp that they unite all of the indigenous peoples of the country, which are over 300 different indigenous peoples, in this camp with thousands of people in Brasilia to discuss the main agenda and of the year and what they're going to be doing through the year in terms of fight agenda and struggles. And they're going to discuss COP this year in this camp that is happening in Brasilia. And also they're going to be camping again in Belém during the conference. So I think this is something different that it's going to happen this year that it didn't happen the past COPs, is that we're going to have a very mobilized civil society in Belém. And we're going to have marches, we're going to have campings, we're going to have protests, we're going to have a lot of people who do not live in the Amazon or do not live in Belém, but it's coming to Belém just to be there, even though they cannot access conference spaces and the negotiation tables. They're going to be outside of the conference, putting pressure on the global leaders that are going to be there. And I think this is going to make a huge difference, at least as an activist and as a person who comes from social movements. I have to believe in that the pressure that the people is going to put in those global leaders is also going to make a big difference in this COP, because this is a different COP than the past ones that we had. First, because it's not a dictatorship, so we have a democratic government and a democratic space happening in Brazil right now. So we're able to protest, we're able to go to the streets and to take our demands to the streets. So I think this is going to be different in this way because the civil society here in Latin America and in Brazil especially, it's very well organized. And I think the other thing is because we do not have that many oil company lobby within the country, that I think it's going to also help to shift a little bit of the narrative of the COP30, that it's going to be different from the other ones that were in places and in countries where the economy is basically based on oil exportation. So I think we have a really an opportunity actually here in Brazil to make things differently and to actually make a legacy and give a legacy to future conferences of the United Nations about climate and environment, to have these spaces where you can talk with society, where you can actually open civil society's demands and listen to them, and not only to the lobbies of those companies that have always been present in past conferences.
So, as I understand, there are 2 points of difference between the COPs of the previous year, the Chief of Parties, the UN event which happens. A, the location, because of Brazil, which is a renewable center, to put it very precisely, and while the others were different. And B, which I find very interesting, actually, is the possible to participation of the public, civil society, so to say, even though it may not have a seat at the table. So you are saying that public opinion and public pressure, even from the outside, is going to matter, and it can change the conversation at the table for the governing bodies and the main participants of COP?
I believe so. I believe so. We had an experience here in the G20 encounter that we have in November that Brazil has hosted here in Rio de Janeiro, which is something that had never happened, which was a place created for civil society. We called it Social G20. It happened before the G20 meeting within the global leaders, and it was a space for civil society, for organizations, collectives, movements to discuss the problems that we think are priority in the country and in the world, such like hunger, climate change, security, education, things that the civil society is working with the movements and on the ground, with grassroots movements. And it was a space for civil society to discuss among themselves, to vote for the things and the demands that they thought that were more important, and to have a letter written for Lula. So the social movements after the G20, the social G20 encounter, they wrote a letter to the president of the republic, which was the person who was hosting the encounter with the other global leaders. And this letter was actually taken in account when creating the final documents and the documents that were concession in the end with the global leaders. So this was a space that was a new thing. It has never happened before in a G20 space. And I think something is also going to happen in the COP30. Not exactly in the same format, but we have a thing here that it's called, I don't know how to translate this in English, but it's a moment, like a pre-conference that it's only for social movement and especially for traditional people's social movements. So it's called Cúpula dos Povos in Portuguese. And it's basically like a people's conference, if we could translate in a literal way. It's like a people's conference before the leaders' conference. And it's also like it's going to come with demands and discussions and plenaries and democratic spaces for civil society organizations and movements to demand things to the president, to Lula. And basically, when those things happen, he comes from social movement. He was a union leader before he became president in his young ages. So he is a person that is more sensitive to those types of mobilizations. So probably, I'm supposing, there's also going to be a moment just like we had in the G20 where Lula is going to receive the demands of the civil society organizations. And even though like these demands are not actually on the table, like Lula does not bring the letter to the table like he did in the G20, the civil society is going to be very well organized outside of the conference. So I don't think it's going to be something easy to ignore, because the city is everyone that on the movement, on the ground, that works with social movements and works in environmentalist agenda especially, are preparing themselves to be present in Belém during the days of the conference. And I think like there's a lot that is going to happen in the city outside of the conference tables, and also like in the peripheries of the city, because the city, just to give some context, Belém is a city that it's a capital city in the state of Pará, but it's not as big as Rio or as big as São Paulo or as big as Brasília. It's a city that it's big, but does not have that big structure to receive a global conference. So the city is right now under construction of a lot of things. So there are hotels being constructed, there are roads being constructed, there are parks being constructed, there are a lot of things going on in the city right now to prepare the city to receive all of these global leaders and all of these people that are going to be in Belém during the days of COP. So the city is already like, ever since last year, I remember going to Belém last year, and everyone was talking about COP30 as well, because this is something that has never happened to the city before. This is like a new thing to receive global leaders, to receive a big conference, to have all of the eyes of the world looking at Belém, looking at this city that is inside of the Amazon rainforest. So this is something that is everyone in the city is moved about it, even though they are not activists, they are not engaged with climate issues, they're not engaged in environmental issues. People in Belém are already feeling that something is happening in the city. So it's also like an opportunity to talk to these people that are not necessarily involved in the political agenda, but are having their daily lives impacted by the conference because it's going to happen in their cities. It's an opportunity to talk to them about climate. It's an opportunity to give a legacy, to have a legacy in the city about the conference. So a lot of movements from Belém, social movements from Belém, are organizing what they're calling yellow zones. What we have in COP30 is the green zone and the blue zone, which is one is a space where civil society can have their tables and panels and their spaces and organize themselves inside the conference. And the other one is a space that is restricted to the global leaders and negotiators. What we're trying to do in Brazil is not only have the green zone and the blue zone, but we're also going to create the yellow zone, which is something that the social movements are creating, which are spaces in the city, not inside the conference building. It's through the city, the yellow zones, to have discussions about climate and environment. So we're going to have in the peripheries of the city, in the favelas of the city, conversations and talks and activities to talk about climate and environment and indigenous lands issues and rights when the conference is going to happen. So this is why I think global leaders are not going to be able to ignore what is going to be happening in the city, because people are preparing a lot of stuff for society in the days of the COP. I think the city is going to be all about that. The city is going to be very crowded in a way that it has never been before. It's going to have a lot of attention in a way that it has never gotten before. And it's a chance of talking to people about issues that affect them. So if we're bringing global leaders to the Amazon, we have to bring the people who live in the Amazon to this conference as well, in a way. So we have to involve them in the discussion. We have to involve them in the discussion that actually affects directly their territory, because we know that the first people that are going to be affected by the climate change are people who live in these areas, in these zones, people who are very well connected with their territory, with the things that come from the land, and people, especially in Belém, which is a big city with a lot of problems, urban problems, including violence, including security, including hunger, poverty, problems with mobility, with education, a lot of structural problems that the city suffers, and is a city that is in the middle of the Amazon. So it's a city that also suffers with the problems that the Amazon is suffering. So for instance, last year we have pretty huge wildfires as we've been having throughout the years. It's something that has started with Bolsonaro but has never stopped. So last year we had a really severe wildfires and a really severe drought. And it affects people who live in Belém, because even though they are in the city, they're also in the biome. They're also in the rainforest, because the city is within the rainforest. So these people suffer with the drought of the rivers. These people suffer with air pollution because of the wildfires. So the wildfires were so big that they were happening in areas that are more far away from the downtown, from the center of the town. But the air was completely different because it was all polluted by the fog of the wildfires. So these are the people who are suffering firsthand the effects of deforestation, the forest destruction, and climate change. So they should also be the first ones to be contacted and consulted when a conference about climate is happening in their territory. So I think this is going to be a very interesting thing to see this year, about how social movements are going to be organized in Belém, and about how the Belém population and people from Pará, which is the state that Belém is the capital, is going to receive this conference as well.
Thank you. That was very interesting, actually. So, just to understand properly, do the indigenous people historically not get a seat at the table in COP?
It's very restricted, I would say, because not every, I think the first thing, when talking about Brazilian indigenous people, which I think I know better than other countries, so I can speak better. But first thing, I think it's the language. I think there is the language barrier that is very important when it comes to United Nations conferences. So a lot of Brazilian indigenous people not even speak Portuguese. They would not imagine English, like to be in a conference speaking in English and sitting in a negotiation table to talk with global leaders about very sometimes technical problems and issues when it comes to the language that those leaders talk. And I think this is the first barrier that they receive. So the language barrier is something that indigenous people face. It's a problem that they face when accessing those spaces. I think another problem is resource. So it's very difficult to have resource to go to Saudi Arabia or to go to Azerbaijan or to be in those places where flight tickets are very expensive and everything goes even more expensive when it comes to accommodation, when it comes to lodging and food when you are traveling abroad. So these are things that are already something that stop that a huge participation of indigenous people in those spaces. So language barrier and resource. And the third thing I think is the credentials. So not every organization gets credentials to participate in those conferences. It's very difficult because we have to be legally registered. Your organization or your collective have to be legally registered. You have to ask for these credentials beforehand so you can access those spaces. So it's not a lot of people who can get those credentials. Many times what happens is big organizations in Brazil, like big NGOs that have access to those credentials, sometimes give away their credentials so indigenous leaders can go to COPs and participate in COPs because their own organizations couldn't get those credentials. So there is a problem with credentials as well. There is also something that has to be negotiated within the civil society. So, like Greenpeace, for instance, can give some of their credentials to indigenous movements, or other NGOs that are big and usually have a lot of credentials can do this and give them away for indigenous leaders to participate. But usually, when we're close to COPs, like when it's October or when it's September, there's some crowdfundings that begin to happen in the country so they can like gather money and give and go the most people that they can to the cops. But it's also every year it's a challenge for this because without these three things like the money resource, the language barrier, and the difficulties in getting credential, it's very difficult to access. Even though Brazil in the past years has been having one of the biggest delegations of indigenous peoples because there is this collective effort among the civil society in terms of getting the resources, in terms of giving away the credentials, in terms of helping also with this thing about the language that have been allowing more indigenous Brazilian people to go to these conferences. But it's still not ideal because those people, they are the ones that have the technology, that have the ancestor technology to tackle climate change. Those are the people who can protect the most their territories because they've been living there for hundreds of years and having this knowledge passed by through generations. So these are the people who should be first consulted when it comes to climate change. And they are not the first ones to be consulted. They have to go through all of these challenges to actually access the space. And when they access the space, it's not like it's guaranteed that they're going to have their voices heard because they're also fighting against the lobbies of the companies, the global leaders that are to the far right, and it's difficult to talk with them. So even when they access those spaces, it's difficult to put the demands forward because their voices are not heard and not considered, and are considered to be something that is actually not helping the development, the economic development of the countries. Because this is the narrative here in Brazil, at least. Because the agribusiness sector is saying that they are developing economically the country, that they are the ones who are putting the country in the economy at first. And the indigenous people are seen as the ones that do not want the development because they want to protect the lands and not exploit the lands. So it's difficult for their voices to be heard even when they reach those spaces, their voices are not heard. So I think COP30 is a chance that since it's happening in their territory, at least they're going to do the discussion the way that they know how to do and with their people and making their voices heard on the ground and on the street and making this noise so it's impossible to ignore them during the conference.
That's interesting. So this is going to be a big change. The people to whom the land belongs traditionally, will hopefully be able to get a voice at the table, at the place where it is supposed to matter. Now, when we say supposed to matter, a lot of people, the voices which one hears nowadays, are treating COP like a circus. They say it's become a circus. Nothing really comes out of it. So, what do you think of its relevance?
Yeah, it's complicated because we need leaders that are committed with the cause, because otherwise it's just going to be like a billionaire event that it takes a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of energy of everyone to every year be gathering people who are talking about climate in different countries of the world and not having the global leaders committed with the things that are being discussed there. So it's not just about uniting these people and having this event that it costs us a lot of money, it costs us a lot of time of people, and not having anything that leaves there with a commitment. So I think the most important thing about those COPs is to have leaders who are committed to taking the demands that are being discussed there forward. Because if they're not committed, it's something that it's a waste of money and time, honestly. And this is why we need leaders not like Donald Trump. We need leaders that are actually committed with climate and they're actually committed with those fights and who actually believe that this is important to save the planet and the people in the planet, because otherwise it's just going to be an event that unites people and but don't have anything that leaves there very well, right?
So, you mentioned about commitment. However, in view of the lack of an accountability structure for COP attendance, what can one really realistically expect of COP? You just mentioned commitment people need, and that commitment has to be internal. It has to be come from a value system. One has to be internally driven. However, in terms of accountability, there is no accountability, right? So, who holds whom accountable?
Yeah, I think this is the real problem, right? Because if those governments and those leaders are more committed to the companies and to the capitalist model than to the rights of the people and the rights of the land, I don't think we're ever gonna go very far, right? Because in the end, oil companies are not interested in saving the planet. They're interested in having more money and having more power. And if those are the people and those are the companies and things that are influencing the most the decision makers, I don't think we're gonna take any advantage of those conferences. So I think like the thing that should happen in order to actually have effective change into actually climate change is to shift from the lobby of the companies to the advocacy of social movements and those indigenous people who have been taking care of the land. And this is a completely new way of understanding the priorities of these governments. So I think this is why the Brazil COP gives me a little bit of hope, because I think it has the potential of having the voices of those people more heard than the voices of the companies. Maybe it's a little bit naive, but at the same time, being in this part of the politics, of the part of the grassroots politics, in the part of the social movements, in the part of people who are trying to mobilize the streets and trying to mobilize people in Belém and people off the territory, they are going to be affected. They are already affected by climate change. I think this is an opportunity that we have to actually have those governments more committed to the people than to the money. And I think this is a chance that we have to try to shift this narrative and this influence in the decision makers. And I hope the leaders that come to Amazon in this year, that come to Belém this year, they also have the opportunity to see the way of living of the originary people of this country and how the relationship with nature is another type of relationship. It's a relationship of respect, is a relationship of gratitude, is a relationship of spirituality, including. because those indigenous people, they consider nature as an entity. They consider the mother nature that gives life to people, that gives everything that we have. So it's a relationship about a lot of respect. And I think that if these global leaders can actually capture the essence of the relationship between the peoples with their territories and how important this is for the whole life of not only those people, but for the planet, I think this is going to be the most important legacy that we can have to these leaders, because they're going to know the reality of the people who live in the Amazon, and they're going to know the way that they see the world and why this is not just a political cause, but this is a life cause. This is a spiritual cause. This is a cause that is about a lot of the aspects of the life of those people. So it's not something trivial. It's something that for Brazilians, for Latin Americans, their relationship with Mother Nature is something that no money can take from us, because this is way more deep than just a conference. This is about the life of those people. This is about the identity of those people. This is about a whole way of culture and of living of those people, and a historical one, because these people have been in the Amazon territory for over 10,000 years, way before the Portuguese have arrived here, way before the colonization process that we had in this territory. So their relationship with this land, with this forest, with these biomes that we have here in the continent is ancestral. So it's something that I think that if these global leaders can actually manage to understand and be open to understand this culture and to land in Brazil with this eye of, okay, we're trying to understand how important this planet is for these people, I think this would change maybe the narrative of everything. And I think this is the most important thing that can happen, to have the conference happening in the Amazon. So, with the civil society mobilized, with global leaders seeing actually how is the relationship with the people, with their territory here in Brazil, I think this is something to be hopeful for, maybe.
It's interesting. What you are saying, it I totally believe in, and I'm so glad you said this, is the power of the civil society. And you are saying this could be a complete game changer and a conversation changer, because the power would come to into the hands of the people to be able, or possibly, or the hope of it, to lead the conversation and to affect policies and to bridge the gap and to try and force the hand. Now, let me bring a picture which I have. And I totally believe in that. People, climate, earth. And people are the crucial elements between the climate and the earth, the binding factor, the responsible factor. Now, when we say people here right now, for this context, we're talking of civic society, the civilians. And in this context, even deeper, the indigenous society, the land belongs to them. They belong to the land. So they would understand the earth, its language, its needs, its requirements better. They would be in a better position to translate what the earth needs to the people who may not, who become so far from the land and the earth that they don't understand the need and the requirements, and how to bring back balance into the world that we have reached today, where we are screaming climate change, climate change. So we are there, time has arrived, but how can we reverse it? How can we balance it? What can we do better? Is what the people can tell us. Now, you explained the challenge of sometimes, of generally having those people having a seat at the table. In this context, I totally understand A, the logistics, B, the language. How would that happen? Though one could say have translators, etc. How would that happen? How would they get at this, be able to voice whatever they want to voice to the world at large? I'm assuming there would be translators. It's a very dumb question when asking, but do humor me.
I think that there is something new in the indigenous movement of the past 5 years or so, which is the use of technology. And it's something that the indigenous peoples in Brazil, many of them, especially in the Amazon rainforest, they escaped. So when the Portuguese arrived, they hid themselves. They went even further in the rainforest to hid themselves from the colonizers, and they stayed hidden for a long time. Now, with the problems that we've been facing with climate change, of the internal problems in Brazil, indigenous people have realized that they cannot be hidden, that they have to voice their demands, that they have to fight for political rights because they were forced to fight for the rights. And also, they've been using a lot of the internet to stop hiding themselves, to stop hiding themselves. So, a lot of indigenous movements here in Brazil have been using a lot of Instagram, a lot of TikTok, a lot of Facebook, a lot of WhatsApp, and all of these new technologies and big text technologies to actually talk to people. And in the internet, it's a little bit easier, the language barrier, because we can use subtitles, because we can have instant translation. It's a little bit easier to talk about your territory without leaving your territory. So this is something that has been happening and putting the indigenous movement in Brazil in a spotlight here, because they know how to do it really well. They have really good activist communicators in the territory. They have really good people in audiovisual production, in social media. Now in the camp that they're doing in Brasilia, the yearly camp that they have there, they have like a group of indigenous people just taking care of the communication and doing the narratives themselves. So those are indigenous people that are telling their own stories with the technology that it's easier to have nowadays. So these are demands that are being voiced more and that are reaching more people than ever before. And I think this is something that will also be important in terms of how do they reach those spaces, even though if they're not in the tables of the conversation, if they cannot speak proper English to talk to negotiators, they still can use those resources that also mobilize a lot of civil society outside of the conference. And I think this is something that is also going to be very important in terms of, okay, maybe they cannot talk face to face with the president or the prime minister of another country, but they can do it with society. And if they can speak with the Brazilian society, for instance, there are many people in the Brazilian society that can speak with those negotiators. So just like I said, this is where the big NGOs and big organizations that are committed with climate and with indigenous rights, they come in. Not only when it comes to allowing resources for those people to participate or to giving away credentials for those indigenous people to be in the conference, but also to bridging this language, and not only the English or Portuguese or indigenous languages, but also the technical language that sometimes the indigenous people, they are talking about their territory in a language that's not the language of their researchers or of the negotiators, because it's another type of saying, of speaking. And sometimes people, the researchers and people who are from NGOs in Brazil that are committed to environment and indigenous causes, they are this bridge as well. So I think this is the importance also of having people in different places when we're talking about fights and struggles in social movements. So there are people who are in the territory, who are in the base of everything, and there are people who are in universities, who are in the government, who are in different in NGOs, in different parts of the civil society that can help this conversation happen as well. That can translate not only to Portuguese or to English, but can translate their demands into the technical language that the negotiators speak. So I think this is importance also of having an organized civil society in a way that we can not only share even more the contents that they are making about their own territory and the denounces that they're making about their own territory, but also to bridge this conversation between what's happening in the territories and what's happening globally. So I think this is where those people come in and help also bridging this communication.
In your opinion, is climate change and climate action a player in transformation of conflict to peace on a global platform, both locally and globally?
I think so, because there is an indigenous leader here. She is actually the minister of indigenous people in Lula's government. Her name is Sonia Guajajara. That she has a quote that says that the fight for Mother Earth is the mother of all fights. And I think like if we're fighting for Mother Earth and if we're fighting for the earth and the climate and the territory and the places that we belong to, the land that we belong to, we're fighting for ourselves. So we're fighting for when we resolve this conflict with the land, we're also resolving conflict within among society. So I think that the movements for social justice, for climate justice, and for indigenous lands rights, they are movements for us to be in peace with Earth. And for us to be in peace with Earth is to be in peace with our spirituality, as I was saying, that it's not something that is disconnected. The nature and the spirituality and the society and everything that is cultural, it's very deeply connected with Mother Earth. So if we're protecting the earth, if we're fighting for the earth, if we're fighting for land, for the territory, we're fighting for our lives and for the ways that we live in peace with earth and with society. So I think those things are not disconnected. I think like if we're trying to be in harmony with our rivers, with our skies, with our mountains, with our beaches, with everything that hugs us in a way and say that we belong to this land, we belong to this planet, we belong to this society, I think we're making peace with ourselves. And I think the fight for climate justice and the fight for the earth is something that, yeah, it's a fight for peace and justice as well.
So beautifully said, and I totally believe in that. That's why the concept of people, climate, earth. Now, why do you do what you do?
Ooh, tough question.
Because you do a lot. I see that you
Yeah.
believe in it a lot.
Mhm.
So, why do you do what you do?
I I usually say that my school of activism and school of politics was the student movement because when I was 19 years old, I slept 40 days, 45 days in the rectory building of the university I used to study because there were some austerity reforms happening after the coup d'etat we suffered in 2016. And the university was very mobilized. We had over 1,000 universities all over the country that were occupied by them. And it was a very important movement. I think it was one of the most historical ones in this decade and in this century, maybe, which was this uprising of the students in 2016. And ever since this happened, I have been dedicating myself to activism and social causes. So I have been engaged in very different social movements, in political parties, in electoral politics. So this is something that I have been dedicating my life to and have been educating myself about as well. Because I think like when I was in the student movement, I got the opportunity to meet a lot of people and people who come from different realities than I do and different places than I do. For instance, indigenous peoples or quilombolas people. And this is something that has touched me since the first time, like to actually know those realities and to know that as a social movement, we have the power to shift those realities and we have the power to actually do something about it. I think this is something that the hope of changing things is something that inspires me. And the fact that we have social movements in Brazil that are very committed to this hope and to this hope of changing things. I think this is something that moves me. I think those stories of those leaders move me. The stories of those people moves me, and the hope that they have in their fight, that is a daily fight, also moves me. So these are the people that I want to always work alongside with them and to learn with them because I know that I live in a big city right now. I live in Rio, which is a city with over 6 million people. It's a very polluted city. It's a very violent city. It has a lot of problems. And I see that people who live in urban centers and big cities like I do, we are sick. We are getting sick because this is not how we are supposed to live. Like in big buildings with a lot of air pollution and noise pollution, and in this very fast paced daily lives that we had, and a lot of crowded buses and traffic. And there's a lot of things going on in the big cities that are making us sick. And this is also a symptom of capitalism and the ways that we've been living our lives. And I learn a lot with indigenous people here in Brazil, working alongside with them in Brazil. I learned a lot about how we should live in a more harmony way. And we do that by living within the nature, by living with things that nature gives us, by living close to the sea, to the river, by listening to the animals, by listening to the trees, by staying like in silent places, having this spaces where we can actually connect more with the earth and with ourselves. And the indigenous peoples of Brazil and of Latin America as a whole teach me a lot about how to be less sick living in the world that we're living right now, especially living in a big city like Rio. And I feel like ever since I've been engaged with social movements since I was a teenage girl, I've been learning a lot of people from social movements and especially from indigenous peoples. And I will not abandon this fight with them because I know that if they're fighting for Mother Nature, they're fighting for me as well. So I should be fighting with them because this is something that it's not a struggle that it's going to be won only by the 1% of indigenous people that we have in Brazil. This is something that has to be a national movement, has to be a national mobilization, has to impact people who are in the big cities, who are not in the Amazon, who are not indigenous, but who also live in this planet and wants to know better ways to be in harmony with this planet. So I think like I do what I do because I really believe in the philosophy, the indigenous philosophy that is the how we have a relationship with this territory here, with this continent here. And it's something that also it's about my ancestors as well. It's about people who have been before me in this place and has respected this place that I'm in right now. And this is also about future generations and how we have this responsibility as well to live a world less sick than it is right now. And I think the only way of doing it is to be in peace with Earth and alongside with the indigenous comrades.
Thank you for sharing that. And I would like to end the conversation with a beautiful quote. The fight for Mother Earth is the mother of all fights. It's beautiful. Thank you for being there and also for coming on the platform and sharing so much of yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Meenu.
Thank you for listening to the series Between the East and the West. Do subscribe to the channels mentioned on the site in case, of course, you liked what you heard. I am Meenu Gupta, the host of the series, and I'll be looking forward to your comments. We love feedback. Thank you once again. Namaste and bye-bye.